In the past, people believed that race was a biological fact based on traits like skin color. But today, science shows us that's simply not true. The idea of race as biology was actually built during times of European colonialism to justify domination over non-white people. Even though that biological idea has been debunked, the concept of race still exists in society because it's socially constructed. That means we give meaning to race through our social systems, attitudes, and practices, a process called racialization. This has real consequences. It creates divisions and leads to the marginalization and oppression of racialized groups. You'll notice that we now use terms like racialized person instead of older terms like visible minority or non-white. This shift reflects a deeper understanding of how race is constructed and how language can either reinforce or challenge discrimination. Racism isn't just about individual actions like jokes or slurs. It also shows up in the systems around us, like in policing, education, healthcare, and employment. Even if it's not always visible, it can be deeply rooted in how things work. To bring this to life, consider Samuel, a black student in Canada. Every day he's reminded of his race, not just in obvious ways, but in the subtle things people say and do. He's stared at, touched, asked where he's from, and expected to speak on behalf of all black people. Even when others claim to be colorblind, they often act in ways that show otherwise. His story is a powerful reminder of how racism operates on many levels, and why it's so important to start by acknowledging that reality. Now, let's focus on the idea of race as a biological myth. For centuries, race was used to divide humans into distinct groups based on physical traits like skin color. This division led to a color line that reinforced ideas of racial superiority, especially white superiority. In the 1800s, scientists like Samuel Morton tried to prove that different races had different brain sizes. He used skull measurements to claim that Europeans had the largest brains and Africans the smallest. These ideas were not just wrong, they were used to give a scientific sheen to racism. Later, others continued this pseudoscience, including a Canadian professor who argued that IQ scores should guide immigration policy, favoring some European groups while discouraging others. Even into the 1980s, claims about intelligence and race persisted. Philippe Rushton made headlines with theories ranking racial groups by intelligence, ideas that were widely denounced by scientists, including geneticist David Suzuki, who called them monstrous. This isn't just ancient history. These beliefs show up in popular culture too. Comedian Dave Chappelle's racial draft sketch pokes fun at the ridiculousness of trying to fit people into neat racial boxes. And the reality is, yes, we all see physical differences, faces, skin, hair. But these differences don't map onto intelligence or ability. What matters is the meaning we assign to these appearances. That meaning is learned, and because it's learned, it can be unlearned. The whole concept of race is not about biology, it's about power. Race was used to create a dominant group that controlled what counted as history, culture, and success. We see this in education too, like the creation of the Afrocentric Alternative School in Toronto, which was a response to a curriculum that excluded African heritage. So if we know race isn't biological, then we also know that racism isn't about your DNA. It's about how society gives certain meanings to physical differences, and how those meanings get embedded in power structures. The good news is, if racism is socially constructed, then we have the power to take it apart. Even though race isn't grounded in biology, it still deeply shapes people's lives. That's because racism is very real. As long as racism exists within a society, race will continue to matter, because the effects are felt in everyday experiences. Pretending otherwise would deny the realities faced by racialized people like Samuel and countless others across Canada. Defining racism can be tricky. It's complex and multidimensional. In Canada, most people understand racism as personal acts of discrimination, name-calling, graffiti, insults, threats, or hate crimes. These are obvious and easier to see, but racism goes far beyond that. It's also baked into the systems and structures we're part of: education, policing, media, employment. Sociologists define it as the patterns of privilege and oppression that continue whether or not the actions are intentional. One helpful way to understand this is with a simple equation. Racism equals prejudice plus discrimination plus power. That power is what turns personal bias into something systemic, into real-life advantages for some and barriers for others. Racism exists in different forms. Representational racism shows up in imagery and pop culture. Think of old cartoons, movie characters, or even sports mascots like the former Cleveland Indians, Chief Wahoo, or the Edmonton Eskimos. These images promote stereotypes that devalue and dehumanize racialized groups. Even Disney films contain these elements, like the crows in Dumbo, the character Sunflower in Fantasia, or the stereotyped Siamese cats in Lady and the Tramp. These may seem trivial, but they subtly shape the way we think about race. Ideological racism is about belief systems. Societies are filled with ideas that reflect and reinforce existing power structures. Racist ideology presents these ideas as common sense or natural. Historically, ideological racism has justified colonialism, slavery, and exclusionary immigration laws. More recently, it's reflected in statements like those made during the 2016 U.S. election campaign, such as calling Mexican immigrants rapists or suggesting a Muslim ban. These ideas reinforce harmful racial hierarchies under the guise of national security or public safety. Discursive racism is communicated through language, both spoken and written. It includes racial slurs and hate speech, but also more subtle patterns like loaded terms or stereotyping in everyday speech. The way we talk about people shapes how we see them. Interactional racism happens in social interactions, like when someone clutches their purse tighter walking past a black man, or assumes a racialized person is an entry-level employee, not the owner. Even being ignored or excluded in conversation can be a form of racism. Samuel's story, where people stare at him or expect him to speak for all black people, is a clear example. Racism also operates at multiple levels. Individual racism is about personal attitudes and actions. These can be obvious, like name-calling or hate crimes, or more subtle, like exclusion, silencing, or everyday microaggressions. Institutional racism is harder to see but deeply rooted. It lives in the policies and routines of schools, businesses, and governments. Often it's disguised as business as usual. Think about how certain communities are policed more heavily, or how school curriculums might erase indigenous or racialized histories. Societal racism is the big picture. It's the cultural framework that normalizes all the other forms. It shapes how we think, what stories we hear, and who we see as Canadian or normal. And this form of racism supports stereotypes, exclusion, and the invisibility of racialized contributions to society. A common question from students is, isn't racism just ignorance? But as historian Robin D.G. Kelly argues, racism isn't a lack of knowledge. It's a complex system of knowledge. Religion, science, politics, and education have all been used historically to justify inequality. Racism, then, is not just about what people don't know, it's also about what society has taught them to believe. Here's why this matters. Because if racism is socially constructed, then it can be socially deconstructed. It was built, and we can take it apart. That's the hope that drives anti-racist educators and activists. To address racism, the first thing we need to do is acknowledge that it exists. That might sound simple, but it's often the hardest step, especially in Canada, where racism is frequently denied or downplayed. For those who don't experience racism directly, it's easier to believe it doesn't happen or that it only exists elsewhere. But that denial causes real harm, not just to racialized individuals and communities, but to society as a whole. It prevents real progress and understanding. Despite meaningful progress, racism and racial discrimination are still very real in Canadian society. The Ontario Human Rights Commission states clearly that recognizing this fact is essential. It's the foundation for addressing racial injustice. In Canada, our conversations about racism are often limited. Compared to the US, where race is commonly discussed in a black-white binary shaped by the legacy of slavery, Canadian discussions are often more muted or dismissed altogether. We might think of racism as something from the past, or as something that only happens in other countries. But that's not the case. Historian Afua Cooper calls slavery Canada's best kept secret, reminding us that we often try to distance ourselves from our own history. And yes, Canada has made efforts to recognize and apologize for past wrongs. the eviction of Africville's black community in Halifax, the Komagata Maru incident that denied entry to Indo-Canadian immigrants, the Indian residential school system that harmed generations of Indigenous children, the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, the forced relocation of Inuit families to the high Arctic, the Chinese head tax, which separated families for decades. These formal apologies are important, but they don't mean the work is done. The past continues to shape the present. We've taken international steps too. Canada signed the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and later the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We recognize the importance of anti-racism globally, so the question is, are we ready to fully confront it at home? Incidents in recent years suggest that racism in Canada is very much alive. In Montreal, business students wore blackface and mocked Jamaican culture. At the University of Ottawa, racist graffiti was found in a law school bathroom. Brock University students wore blackface to a Halloween contest and even won a prize. Faculty members there wrote an open letter reminding the public that these acts are not harmless jokes. They are rooted in a legacy of white supremacy and colonialism. The problem is, racism is too often seen as isolated events carried out by ignorant individuals. But it's not just about intention. Racism is embedded in our social structures, our institutions, and everyday practices. People like Samuel live with this reality daily, while others may still question whether racism even exists in Canada. This disconnect between lived experience and public denial makes the work of anti-racist education difficult but absolutely essential. The first step is clear. We have to stop denying and start acknowledging that racism in Canada is real, persistent, and deeply woven into the fabric of society. White privilege is often invisible to those who benefit from it. A powerful example is the Crayola crayon that used to be labeled flesh, as if one skin tone represented everyone. This small detail reflects a broader system where whiteness is the default, the norm. Anti-racism educators like Tim Wise explain that for white people, their legitimacy often isn't questioned. Where they live, go to school, or work is rarely scrutinized. That's privilege. But when white privilege is pointed out, it's often met with resistance. Many white people don't want to believe that the systems around them are structured to benefit them. In multicultural Canada, white people can still largely expect that society will work in their favor as long as they follow the rules. This belief supports an illusion of fairness, even while racialized people face barriers those in dominant groups often don't see. One clear example is residential segregation. The Toronto Star reported on white flight in Brampton, a city where the white population dropped by over 23,000 in a decade, while racialized communities grew. This kind of racial sorting is rarely openly discussed, but it reinforces inequality. Scholars like Eduardo Bonilla Silva and Tim Wise argue that white isolation, living, working, and socializing in racially homogenous settings, can create distorted views of race. If children grow up in these environments without ever discussing racism, they may believe inequalities are natural or due to personal failings rather than systemic issues. White privilege is often protected by coded language, criticisms of employment equity, opposition to Indigenous tax exemptions, or complaints about inclusive language are ways of resisting equity under the guise of fairness. Bonilla Silva describes this as the language of liberalism, where people say things like, "I believe in equal opportunity, so I oppose affirmative action." They see themselves as race neutral, but in doing so, they ignore how race continues to shape outcomes. We also see this mindset in responses to stories like Samuel's. One student, Ashley, said, "Why do you always think about race? We're all just one human race." Her comment was met with applause. But this idea, often called colorblindness, is deeply problematic. Colorblindness sounds like a good idea on the surface. Treat everyone the same, ignore race. But as civil rights leader Julian Bond said, being colorblind means being blind to the consequences of color. Ignoring race doesn't solve racism. It erases the reality of those who live it. Anti-racist educator Jane Elliott addresses this in her famous blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise. When students say, "I don't see you as black," she responds, "That's not your choice to make." Saying you don't see someone's race is denying a part of who they are. You're essentially saying, I'll only see you if I can make you fit my worldview. Why do people cling to color blindness? Often it's fear of being called racist or fear of confronting uncomfortable truths. But seeing race doesn't make you racist. Acting on racial stereotypes or refusing to acknowledge the significance of race, that's what perpetuates racism. And it's hard to challenge this when so many messages we receive from families, media, and other social institutions reinforce racial norms. Recognizing white privilege and confronting its denial is essential if we're serious about equity. Because ignoring race doesn't make racism disappear. It makes it harder to fight. When we think about racism, we often focus on individual attitudes or systemic policies, but it's equally important to understand how racism intersects with the law, especially in the context of hate crimes and white supremacy. A hate crime is a criminal act motivated by hate, targeting someone based on their race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. These acts may be violent, like assaults, or nonviolent, such as vandalism and harassment. Either way, the harm extends beyond the individual to the entire community targeted. Canada is actively involved in international efforts to track and respond to hate crimes. Our criminal code has several sections that directly address hate. Sections 318 and 319 make it illegal to advocate for genocide or publicly incite hatred against identifiable groups. Section 78.2 of the code further requires courts to consider hate motivation as an aggravating factor during sentencing. While Canada protects freedom of speech through Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that right isn't absolute. Section 1 of the Charter allows for reasonable limits on those freedoms, especially when it comes to hate speech. A landmark case is that of William Whatcott, where the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously upheld that limiting hate speech is justified in a democratic society. This is very different from the US, where free speech is more broadly protected, even if it includes hateful views. Despite these legal protections, hate crimes in Canada persist. In 2011, over half of all police-reported hate crimes were motivated by race or ethnicity. Among these, Black Canadians were the most frequent targets, representing 21% of such incidents. These statistics underline a troubling and consistent trend. Racism remains a central motivator of hate-based violence in Canada. Some of these acts are linked to organized white supremacist groups whose ideology is built on the myth of white racial superiority. These groups promote overt racism and seek to spread hate through acts and rhetoric. But hate crimes aren't always committed by group members. Individuals influenced by these ideologies can act independently, causing harm just the same. In recent years, white supremacy has evolved into a more strategic form, white nationalism. It uses political language to push ideas of racial separation under the banner of cultural preservation or national identity. Groups like the Aryan Guard and Canadian Heritage Alliance challenge immigration, oppose human rights legislation, and promote anti-integration agendas. Their goal is still racial dominance, but they frame it as patriotism. There's also neo-Nazism, a branch of white supremacy that's explicitly anti-Semitic. Groups like Blood and Honor and Final Solution Skins spread this ideology and often use symbols to identify one another. Law enforcement has documented the use of tattoos, numbers, and colors as coded messages. 88 stands for Heil Hitler. H is the eighth letter. 311 represents KKK. K equals 11th letter repeated 3 times. 420 may reference Hitler's birthday. Red shoelaces may signal participation in racial violence. 100% often implies racial purity. These symbols help members signal allegiance without using explicit language, making the movement harder to detect. Recognizing these signs is essential for educators, law enforcement, and the public. Ultimately, while Canada's legal system formally opposes hate and protects against discrimination, the existence and evolution of white supremacist ideologies show us that racism continues to manifest in violent and organized ways. The law is one tool, but fighting racism also requires public awareness, education, and persistent societal effort. Racial profiling is one of the most controversial issues in Canada's criminal justice system. The phrase, "the color of justice in Canada is white," reflects how deeply race influences who gets stopped, questioned, and how individuals are treated by law enforcement and the courts. One tragic example is the death of an unarmed protester during a land rights demonstration in Ipperwash Provincial Park. A public inquiry concluded that racism contributed to the failure of police to resolve the situation peacefully. This incident became symbolic of the broader historical injustices faced by Indigenous peoples, including land dispossession, broken treaties, residential schools, and child apprehension. Racial profiling doesn't only affect Indigenous people. Black youth in Toronto have long reported being unfairly targeted under local laws, and reports have confirmed that these practices are applied unevenly. In Vancouver, a non-English speaking immigrant died after being repeatedly tasered by airport police officers who failed to find a translator or de-escalate the situation. In Saskatoon, Indigenous men were taken out of town and left in the cold by police. Several died as a result. The issue goes beyond individual incidents. A study in one Ontario city found that Black drivers were 4 times more likely to be stopped by police than white drivers. Indigenous people were also stopped at significantly higher rates. These numbers confirm what many racialized communities have experienced for years. Racial profiling isn't always about policing. It can happen in schools, stores, workplaces, and housing. Profiling happens when someone is singled out based on race, ancestry, or place of origin, rather than any reasonable suspicion. Examples include a store employee following a shopper around, or an employer tightening security checks for a racialized staff member without cause. In policing, racial profiling shows up in stop and search practices, disproportionate surveillance in racialized neighborhoods, and assumptions about criminality. This practice has been commonly referred to as driving while black. One police tactic, known as carding, has received particular criticism. This involved stopping people on the street without clear cause, questioning them, and keeping a record. Racialized individuals were disproportionately affected. In response to public concern, new regulations were introduced in 2017 to limit when and how officers could conduct street checks. Officers are now required to provide a reason, a receipt, and information on how to file a complaint. Despite these steps forward, the issue is far from resolved. Indigenous and racialized communities have led much of the advocacy for reform. In response, some police forces have started to adopt more inclusive frameworks and policies. One example is a policing framework that includes formal partnerships with Indigenous liaison teams to ensure more respectful, culturally informed responses during critical incidents. At this point, the question is no longer whether racial profiling happens in Canada. It clearly does. The challenge is how we hold systems accountable, push for real reform, and ensure all communities are treated with fairness and dignity under the law. How do we move toward a society where race no longer determines how people are treated, where someone's skin color holds no more significance than the color of their eyes? This is often described as the idea of a post-racial society, a world where race doesn't matter anymore. Some argue that the best way to eliminate racism is to stop talking about it altogether. The idea is that if we no longer label or focus on race, we'll stop reinforcing racial divisions. While this argument can sound appealing, it oversimplifies a very complex issue. One example often cited is the objection to Black History Month, with the suggestion that it reduces Black contributions to a single month while white history is treated as the default year-round. That critique raises a valid point. Black history should be seen as an integral part of Canadian history, not just something acknowledged in February. In Canada, the history of Black communities has often been excluded from mainstream narratives. Many people don't know that African Canadians fought in the War of 1812, that Black loyalists settled in the Maritimes, or that slavery once existed in what is now Canada. The problem isn't that we talk about these things in February. It's that we don't talk about them enough during the rest of the year. The same concern applies to other heritage months, Asian Heritage Month in May, or National Indigenous History Month in June. What happens when these months are over? Do we return to centering only one narrative, treating others as side stories? These observances can raise awareness and correct gaps in the historical record, but if they're not backed by lasting change, they risk becoming token gestures. Without deeper integration of diverse histories, we risk reducing important voices to brief moments of recognition that don't challenge existing power structures. To truly eliminate racism, we need more than symbolic inclusion. We need to embed diverse experiences into the core of what we teach, how we understand history, and how we share knowledge. This requires shifting power, moving beyond surface level change to systemic transformation. The key is not to stop talking about race, but to start talking about it differently, not as a problem to avoid, but as a reality to understand. And from there, work toward building a society where everyone's story is included, valued, and told, not just during a designated month, but all year long.